As I mentioned, we are so blessed to have Maria here with us. In a few words, I'll try to summarize her extensive bio. She is a contemplative and practical mystic who is in grateful recovery. Career-wise, she's an award-winning writer who has published as a journalist, essayist, poet, known as a trailblazer for social media and blogs. She's a storyteller at heart, and has made films, performed live, produced multidisciplinary concerts focused on poetry and sound healing. On a more spiritual path, she's a certified yoga instructor and founder of Heart Camp on Conference, and also the publisher of the forthcoming Heart-Centered Living newsletter, which we included into the newsletter, by the way, so you can sign up and receive those newsletters coming out starting September 13th, I believe. Maria, please correct me there, or please add on anything that I omitted. We'd love to hear more of your story, and I'll also pass on the mic to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Katerina, for your service. This entire summer, it's been wonderful to have you leading these services. And I want to just say welcome to a couple of people who just popped in who are new. And so to begin, I would like to honor my ancestral lineages that brought me here, the countless of ones who have shared their knowledge with me, and the land in which I birthed these thoughts, to the First Nation Anacostians, where I was literally thinking about this while I was hiking through the Rock Creek Park, rather unwisely in flip-flops. I need to wear my hiking shoes. So speaking of taking steps, let's go back to the beginning of this prayer. I invite you to close your eyes and take a deep breath and relax your shoulders and sink into that feeling of your breath sustaining you. And let go of the day. And now I'm going to say the words in the Aramaic that Yeshua would have said in the way that I learned it. Abun, Abun, Abun de Bashmaya. Netkar Shemak, Dete Malkutach, Nekwe Serianach, Aikana de Bashmaya Af Ba'arha. Ablan Nakma de Sun Kanan Yamana. Washboklan Chabein Waktahain, Aikana Dafkanan, Shoken Chayabein. Wela Telan Lenesuna, Elapatsan Min Bisha. Metol de la Hei Malkutach, Waikhalawatish Bukta, Lalam Almin. Amen, Amen, Amen. And so here we go. I have a lot to cover. And I just want to tell you that the more I study, the less I know. But that's okay, because the whole point of the mystical enterprise and the contemplative way of life is to unlearn everything after you've learned it. Some of the lessons behind this prayer: to stay humble, accountable, open-minded, flexible, heart-centered, and curious, embracing life even in the certainty of death, and keeping a sense of humor. It's really the impossible and in the possible. But that's been what I've learned, especially this last year in my journey of sobriety. So for me, rather than this being a vexing problem, it is a delight. And I offer this share today with the caveat that while I do study things, I also know nothing. And I prove nothing except hopefully to spark your curiosity on your own path. And this is important because I don't evangelize Alcoholics Anonymous, which we'll be talking about. And in fact, the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous, well, one of the traditions is attraction and not promotion. So I'm going to share various threads of one of my ongoing spiritual inquiries, which today happens to be about the 12 steps and the Lord's Prayer as a design for living, as it's worked for me. And of course, I have to say, hi, I'm Maria, I'm an alcoholic, even though this isn't an AA meeting. And I just want to give you a little background, but I have issues with alcohol my whole life. I don't even know how I'm alive, or I have a liver, but here I am, thank you, God. And I did achieve 5 years of sobriety before I relapsed last year into this year. And now I am 7 months sober. And so yay. But this time, I'm deeply sober. And it's not just about not drinking, right? And earlier this year, I had an opportunity to study with Dr. James Finley, who is a clinical psychologist and a student of the 20th century mystic and scholar Thomas Merton. That's one of the lineages right there. And what that taught me was a mystical sobriety, which really applies to all of us in any addictions that we all have, and there are many, and that's a whole other talk. Reverend Taffel did one about that a while back. That this isn't just about not drinking. That's just the surface of tip of the iceberg right there. I'd also like to point out, and this is very timely, I didn't plan it this way, but here we are, that it's National Recovery Month. And this was something established in 1989 to focus on what we now call substance use disorder. We're not supposed to call it alcoholism anymore, but because it could be any substance, or there are also process addictions and all kinds of other addictions that keep us from managing a healthy life. So some recent stats, there are currently more than 20 million recovering substance use disorder people in the US alone, and an estimated 2 million, though, around the world are in AA. And the CDC points out that between 2011 and 2015, excessive drinking was responsible for an average of almost 96,000 deaths, which is 261 per day. And so even the White House got involved recently and did a proclamation and put forth $22 billion from Congress to address the problem. So yes, it is a thing. And likely it has been since time immemorial, when human beings figured out how to ferment sugars into alcohol, or that nature comes in with built-in psychoactive substances that change our moods. And so, although it is beyond the scope of this talk, consider that in the 20th century, the temperance movement, led mainly by women, was in response to men's drinking, because life had become unmanageable. That's step one of the alcohol steps. And then prohibition ensued, and we know that that didn't work. But for a long time, people have been trying to beat this thing. And so let me get back to me. I am a grateful recovering alcoholic. I am also a recovered Catholic. I am Cuban American. I'm the granddaughter of Spanish people, very Catholic people. I did my first communion, that whole thing, and then I went to public school and my life became more secular. Fast forward to decades later, when this whole time, I never really thought of the Lord's Prayer as something that could help me. But then through my curiosity and my studies, and I'm partly inspired by my involvement in the Swedenborgian Church, I came across some spiritual retreats led by Dr. Neil Klotz, whose Sufi name is Sadi, and he's an author and scholar in religious studies, spirituality, and psychology. And he works a lot with the native Middle Eastern spirituality within the lineage of Sufism, which is the mysticism of Islam. It's also incredibly relatable. Everyone loves Rumi. When you're reading Rumi, you're reading Sufism. So for this lecture, I'm looking at his book called The Prayer of the Cosmos. It's a very small book, but it is, as Matthew Fox said, revolutionizing. And it's meditations on the Aramaic words of Jesus. So when I first heard the prayer in Aramaic, something in me shifted. These worlds opened, and the more I spoke it, the more visceral it became. And as a poet and a literature teacher, as a scholar, I was and am, of course, interested and fascinated by the scholarly aspect of all of this and the linguistics and the histories. But that's not really the point, because it became highly personal. That's what I was saying. You learn it to unlearn it. Because for me, the setting of the centuries of organized religion and patriarchy, setting that aside, I found these words, as I have words in many faith traditions, to have an immediacy, an intimacy, and words that I could actually chew on and actually use. Now, mind you, I have a Spanish heritage. And someone once told me the other day that I have a Jewish soul. So for my historical self, okay, and perhaps because, Jesus was, he was a Jew before there was Judaism, but yeah, you get it. So for my historical self, I am perhaps more culturally more attuned to the sounds of these words. But we put all that esoterica aside. When it comes down to the brass tacks, there is something about these words that, it breaks through all the noise and all the baggage and all the trauma and of the organized religion and everything. Okay, and I don't necessarily want to poo-poo it, but that's my experience, because it became personal and I could say it with my mouth and feel it in my body. And speaking of noise, because there's a lot of noise in the world right now in this digital age we live in, I also have studied raga and sound and silence as a healing art. In order to make the word flesh. How does this word, living word, live in my body, and how do I act from this body? And when you're an alcoholic, your whole life is messed up and you act in very negative ways. So it's literally tuning into my best self when I am looking at this prayer and seeing how it can help me. And so in the mystical tradition, we might say that deep listening, right, when you're in silence, contemplative prayer, it's not just rote expression, right? And we would say, James Finley would say, repetition is not redundant, because each time you experience this, you're looking at something new and you're really feeling it. So you're saying it sincerely, authentically. Now, the steps. Step taking is everywhere. I thought this was very curious. Katerina, if you can pull up that image by William Blake. How the 12 steps came to be. I mean, in the Old Testament, we have Jacob's ladder, which is a bridge between heaven and earth. You can see here William Blake's pen, ink, and watercolor on paper, done in 1805, who, by the way, was very heavily influenced by Swedenborg. In the Kabbalistic tradition, you have the tree of life, which is kind of like a ladder with different rungs, even though it's called a tree. In the Christian tradition, you had Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote the Interior Castle, which was about 7 dwellings of the soul, and each step is spiritual. In Hinduism, you would speak of the 7 chakras as steps in spiritual development. In Buddhism, you would talk about the Noble Eightfold Path, and many, many, many steps. So I'm sharing this with you because what AA is doing is not unique to AA in the sense that you start at the bottom, and for many alcoholics, you really do hit a bottom. You're in the gutter. Oh my God, please help me, get me out of this, right? In order to ascend to your better self. And so I think you can remove it now, Katerina. Thank you. Now, for me, in my experience of these steps, I knew them, but during those 5 years of sobriety that I had, which was really more just not drinking, I wasn't really practicing them. I didn't have a sponsor. But because I am a member, and by the way, the only requirement is the desire to stop drinking. That's it. Only some of these worlds of my inquiry collided happily, even though that prayer meant nothing to me as a child. Because back then I was just summoning an abstract God that wasn't even in my native language. And suddenly it became more alive in the Aramaic. And I began to learn and draw my own parallels between the spirituality of these steps and the prayer, along with the very practicality of this prayer. And sometimes I don't even call it a prayer because it's really just about checking in. How am I doing today? How can I be my best self? And you see, it's not about not drinking. And so I know what I have to do, but it makes a lot of sense to me in that we also live in a society that is suffering from very collective addictions and trauma and malaise. And it kind of helps me stay sane in this world, besides staying sober. So these are steps that would now then concretize, and let me just share a little AA history with you. That in 1935 was the first AA meeting in Akron, Ohio. And the co-founder was Bill Wilson, who was married to Louise Burnham, who came from a line of Swedenborgians. And our Reverend Taffel is kind of connected with that. She founded Al-Anon for Families as well. And Swedenborg himself had written about some 12 steps, and he hinted at these at this step taking as a way of living out what I call Christ consciousness. I don't necessarily call it the Lord, but it's a consciousness that makes it a living prayer and a living practice. Now, there are other influences in what would become the 12 steps of AA, right? And exactly who did what and who said what and how it got to be, that's a whole dissertation. But I can tell you this right now, that there was a group called the Oxford Group, and there were other pro-temperance fellowships popping up in the US in the late 19th century. And all of this led to the steps as we know them today. Now, what do these steps mean? Okay, basically, if I were to write steps for dummies, is like, help me, I have no idea what I'm doing. And for me, a lot of people hesitate to say surrender. I admitted I'm powerless over alcohol and my life had become unmanageable. I'm surrendering to God. But for me, this is not about giving up agency. It's actually conquering what's holding me back. It's opening a door to co-creation, to the potential. In Aramaic, we would say that I can. It's potential. So when I practice these steps, I'm seeing that heaven is a way of being and achieving a peace that passes understanding, as well as we can while we're in this crazy world, right? But it means going beyond. That peace means going beyond the limits and the constraints of the ego, right? And it's like, we go back to that painting by Blake. You can remember it. You don't have to show it right now, Katerina, but it's ascending, but it's also spiraling, and it's not linear. And we are at the center of this vertical spirituality, but also this human groundedness. And that is the cross. So there is no, it's not like necessarily a direct line. And when you're practicing the steps, and I'm still on step 4, by the way, when I finish, I'm still going to be going back. What step do I need to work on today? What happened? It's my check-in every single night. So for me, in my experience of this marrying of the Aramaic prayer and the deeper meaning and the mystical sobriety of that has become the scaffolding, like a spiritual rebar that keeps me together, because I study the spiritual stuff all the time, but this fellowship and these steps help me. And so they will assuage the despair. I see a lot of people maybe not even realize it, that they're living in great existential despair all the time. And I'm not trying to Pollyanna life. That's not what this is about, but you got to have something to hold on to in order to get through. So I would like to look at some of the particular parts of this text, and maybe Katerina, you could pull up that second item I sent you.
Yes, one moment. Can you see?
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at this line right here. Washboklan haubein waktahein aikana dafkanan shokan lahayabein. And that would be this whole section here, which we would call, well, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now that correlates to step 4, 5, 6, and 7 on some levels, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves, admitted to God and to ourselves and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Humbly asked him to remove all these defects of character. Also 8 and 9, steps 8 and 9, made a list of persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Made direct amends to those people, except when to do so would harm them or others. Now, this whole section here is what I would call the economy of grace. And this is really the meat of the 12-step program, because it requires so much introspection, honesty. You cannot BS yourself or anyone in this step. It's where the real work happens. And it takes a lot of courage and a lot of vulnerability. So I want to read to you from the book. You can change it now, Katerina. All of the ways that we can read this verse. Loose the cords of mistakes binding us as we release the strands we hold of others' guilt. Forgive our hidden past, the secret shames, as we constantly forgive what others hide. Lighten our load of secret debts as we relieve others of their need to repay. Erase the inner marks of our failures make, just as we scrub our hearts of others' faults. Absorb our frustrated hopes and dreams as we embrace those of others with emptiness. untangle the knots within so that we can mend our hearts' simple ties to others. Compost our inner stolen fruit as we forgive others the spoils of their trespassing. Loose the cords of mistakes binding us as we release the strands we hold of others' guilt. And so on and so on. It's very, very rich. You can almost swim in that and get lost beautifully, deliciously lost in those verses. And this holds great power for me and meaning to explore that beyond just say, hey, I'm going to forgive your debts, me forgive mine. Now, I don't want to poo-poo the King James Version. I'm not here to do that. But it's worth thinking about as we study anything, but especially spiritual scripture as first of all, what does it mean to me? But you have to wonder what inherent biases there are, including in this talk, because you know what I like, right? But in all translations, and trying to live in Christ when you have no idea how people thought or the really lived visceral day-to-day experience of an Aramaic speaker, to me feels superficial. And as we can hear, there is such a depth in the original and in a sensuality even. There's a lot of, the ripeness and fruit, the things that are ripe, they're at the right time. And so this, like I said earlier, it just opened up so many worlds to me that when what this happens, which I'm going to share with you right now, it's an incredible feeling. In AA meetings, we sometimes say the Lord's Prayer, and it is controversial because a lot of people don't like the God thing. And I agree that we shouldn't say it unless you can be absolutely sure there is 100% group conscience and agreement that everyone in the meeting wants to say it. Yet it is something to behold. And this is why I keep my eyes open and I look at everyone. We always say we have a nice way of closing, and we get up and we hold hands. And we'll say the Serenity Prayer, and it may or may not be followed by the Lord's Prayer. But while I'm holding everyone else's hands, I mean, we're holding each other's hands in the energetic circle, we're just holding two hands. People from many walks of life, because addiction does not discriminate, rich and poor, whatever, it's black and white, doesn't matter. People of all ages. And I see people who are in their 20s and they're in AA. Wow, you haven't started and you're already doing this. That's incredible. But then, I hang out with people who've been sober for 50 years and then they're in their 80s. We have that in common, this bridge. And then everyone's saying this out loud in English while I'm thinking it in Aramaic. And that phrase, forever and ever, amen. But in Aramaic, we would say from age to age, it renews. It's here and now, in this fullest and present moment. And this design for living, well, it works for me with God as I understand it, her, she, genderless, genderful, because that love and that power is not about the plumbing or the preference, although that's just historical. It's about that love undergirding. And what brings us together, in at least in this fellowship. And that this is a daily and practical checklist that helps me to be a detached witness and an engaged human. It helps me course correct when needed. And it's not a prayer so much of supplication or begging, please help me. Although earlier this year, I was there. I was literally on my knees without health insurance, without a job. Oh my God, how am I here again? I just wanted one glass of wine for Christmas. How did this happen? That's how powerful, cunning, and baffling alcohol is. That's what we say in AA. How can someone like me, clearly level-headed when I'm not drinking, fall? But that's the myth. That's what happens. And being able to step into this practice, though, is it's stepping away from any rigid or dualistic or even catastrophic either or thinking, and it's stepping into a very fertile ground of mutuality, of creativity, of problem solving, of inspiration, of community. And I'm going to end right there. But I will have to say, though, that my understanding of this prayer in Aramaic is what made all the difference in my recovery. Thank you.